Good afternoon, everyone. Ani, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jennifer Beaudry, and I'm a scientist at Science North in Sudbury, Ontario. And I'm very happy to be hosting our first Indigenous Ingenuity Talk. This is tied to our special exhibit, Indigenous Ingenuity Timeless Inventions, that comes to us from the Montreal Science Centre. It is an absolutely amazing exhibit, and I'm really looking forward to welcoming all of you to this really special exhibit, but that's as soon as it's safe to do so. Now, before I begin and introduce our wonderful guest speaker for today, I'd like to acknowledge that Science North sits on the traditional and ancestral lands of the Atikameksheng Anishinaabeg and the Wanapitei First Nations, and that we are in the Robinson-Huron Treaty area. We'd also like to acknowledge the Métis Nations of Ontario for their cultural and economic contributions in this region. Now, with travel restrictions still in play, our special guest today will be joining us virtually from Calgary, Alberta. But I'd also like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising of the Siksika, Piikani, and Gaina First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nation. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our special guest, Deanna Burgart. Welcome, Deanna.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm so happy to be here.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
How's Calgary? Is it sunny out there?
We've got some snow today.
Oh, no.
It's nice.
I'm hoping that's not coming our way, but it is pretty gray over here too.
Is it? Yeah, it's to be expected in Calgary in terms of sort of when is spring going to come, when's the pretend spring, when's the real spring. We just kind of take things as they roll.
Exactly. Now, little introduction about Deanna. Deanna Burgart is Cree Dene from Fond du Lac First Nation in Saskatchewan. She is an engineer. And you know what? As March is the National Engineering Month, we knew that you would be the perfect person to kick off our Indigenous Ingenuity Talk. Now, I know you are very passionate about your culture and engineering, but you're also an instructor, a senior instructor at the Schulich School of Engineering at the University of Calgary.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, what I love the most about you is your story. Now, from a single teen mom without a high school diploma to an engineer, and now you're an advisor to some of Canada's most influential post-secondary institution in the realm of Indigenous inclusion in STEAM, so science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. You have a particular passion for really encouraging Indigenous students to consider careers in STEAM. One of the most powerful tools that you have been using is your story, is your personal story. And you're combining that with your engineering principles and the respect for Mother Earth and really finding solutions to today's challenges. It's just such an inspiration.
Thank you.
Now, Deanna, before I turn things over to you so you can share that story with everybody, I'd like to remind everyone that you are able to ask questions or provide comments. Just by selecting the comment section right beside you, you'll be able to drop those texts and comments in there. And throughout the presentation, I'll be gathering those up. And at the end, we will have a question and answer period. So we'll be able to answer as many questions as we possibly can. Okay? So Deanna, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Okay, great. So can I share my screen now?
Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. And thank you so much. I'm really, really excited to be here. So I'm also very nervous. And I just thought I'd come right out and say that because in your school career and all through your life, you may be asked to give a presentation and nerves don't ever go away.
Nope.
But I had a coach. I thought I'd share this because you might be asked to give a presentation in school this year or next year. And I had a coach that told me one time that it's okay to be nervous because it means that what you're doing matters. And so that's what I'm telling myself right now. Other people have told me to change the word nervous because it has kind of negative connotation to I'm so excited. So I'm like super excited to be here. So I'm going to get started, and I apologize. I won't be able to see myself, so I'll only be able to see my slides. So don't judge my facial expressions. All right, here we go. And this is a new world for everyone, I think, and I'm a little bit new to this platform. So just forgive me while I get this going.
No problem there. I know doing that switch over to the virtual has been, I think we're getting really good at this, but there's always some nuances with every new platform.
Absolutely. Yep, for sure. All right.
Your presentation is beautiful.
Oh, thank you. You're able to see it?
We are, yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction and that wonderful land acknowledgement. It's something that we're seeing more and more often, and I would encourage anyone to get comfortable learning the lands that you are situated on and acknowledging them in presentations or at the beginning of a meeting. We start our school days. Many schools start our school days with the national anthem, and I start my presentations with a land acknowledgement and also my classrooms. So I thank you so much, Jennifer, for starting with the land acknowledgement. In addition to the land that I am situated on right now, which is Treaty 7 region, I wanted to also acknowledge the lands on which I've lived, those of my ancestors, and the traditional territories who have shaped who I am today, including Treaty 8 territory in Northern Alberta and Saskatchewan. My ancestors are from Fort Chipewyan and Fond du Lac, and so I'm Mikisew Cree and Dene, and I am really honored to be speaking here at Science North because Northern Ontario had such a huge role in my story, actually, in bringing my engineering side and my indigeneity and my pathway and reconnecting with my culture into one person. So I'll share that as we go ahead. And also, I'd like to acknowledge that I spent a good portion of time, 7 years of my childhood, living in Singapore in Southeast Asia, which is the traditional lands of the Singaporean Malay people. And so all of these lands and the people that have cared for them since time memorial have shaped who I am today. And I'm honored to be a guest in Treaty 7. Let me start at the very beginning. I was adopted. I was born to a Cree Dene woman and Irish man, and my birth mother was 15 and almost 16 when I was born. And so when I was adopted, my adoption paper said birth father Irish, birth mother unknown. And this is a hard part of our history that you may have started to learn about. And if you haven't, I encourage you to try to learn what you can about Indigenous history in Canada. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that today, but I think when we talk about reconciliation and Indigenous inclusion, it's really important to start with the truth piece and to start with an understanding of the history of colonization and really tough topics that cover the history of residential schools and what's known as the 60s scoop. And the 60s scoop went from the 1960s to probably about the mid 80s, where Indigenous children were removed from Indigenous culture and placed into non-Indigenous families. So I was part of the 60s scoop. And the reason I'm sharing that is because my adoption paper said birth mother unknown. I didn't know I was Cree Dene until I found her later in life. But I was raised by two wonderful parents. My dad is Scottish Canadian born and grew up on a farm in Camrose and went into the oil and gas industry as a heavy duty mechanic. And my mom is a French Canadian from Northern Alberta, and she basically grew up in northern Alberta, in Plamondon, Alberta. And my parents adopted me at the age of 5 months. So that's the earliest picture I have of myself. Um, and then my dad got transferred to Singapore when I was 3 years old. And so that's me, the one on the right. Yeah, that should be your right, I hope. Anyway, I think you can tell which one is me. The other one is, this is my first celebrity photo. The orangutan in the picture, her name is Ahmeng, Ahmeng. And actually, if you Google Ahmeng, you will find she has her own Wikipedia page. She was a very important part of the Singapore Zoo. And I got a chance to meet her many times. I actually have a picture of me having breakfast with her and her baby. And I thought everybody got to do that when they were kids. The picture on the right is the merlion, which is a really beautiful landmark in Singapore. Singapore is in Southeast Asia. So when I grew up, the temperature was about 28 degrees Celsius all year long. It got dark at 7 o'clock every night. Singapore is very close to the equator. It's an island, a city, and a country all in one. And so I had the opportunity to go swimming. I lived in an apartment complex, go swimming every day in the apartment. And the weekends we went to the beach, and I went to an international American school. So I got the chance to learn about cultures from all over the world. And I think that's one of the reasons I've always been so passionate about learning about different cultures. Like, that cultural curiosity has always been a part of me. And I highly recommend it because there's so many beautiful cultures and traditions around the world. So fast forward a bit, we moved back to Canada when I was 10, and I went to junior high and high school here in Calgary. And I didn't quite finish high school. I had my son in grade 12, who is now 26. And I found myself a single mom, and I was working 3 part-time jobs. And it was really, I knew that to take care of my son, I would have to do something different. That was not going to be sustainable. So I decided to go back to school and finish my high school, get my high school diploma, and also upgrade some of my courses, because I wanted to open up my options for what I still wasn't quite sure what I wanted to take in post-secondary, or the direction I wanted to go with my career. So I added, I had I had biology for my science. I had math. I had English, but I needed to get English 30. I had math 20. I can't remember, not math 20, but the next level. And things may have changed by today anyway, so I'm not going to overthink that. But I wanted to upgrade to the university sort of entrance math. So I took math 20, math 30, and math 31. Math 31 is the calculus. And I did all that in my upgrading. And I also took chemistry and physics. And I found out that I actually really loved those science courses. And I ended up getting an A in my calculus course. And with all of those grades and interest, um, one of my teachers said, have you thought about engineering? And I honestly didn't know what an engineer did. I mean, if somebody said engineer to me, I would have pictured a friendly gentleman with a striped hat waving out of a train. And that's about it. And so now this is back before I could Google careers, which you have so much more opportunity to Google possible careers. But back before I could Google careers, they had binders that were put out by the Alberta government where we could search different careers, and it would give us estimated income, estimated salary. It would give us information on the demand of that career, how many people they accepted into post-secondary. And being a single mom, by that point, my son was almost 3. I realized I wanted to focus on the shortest time in post-secondary and the highest expected salary and demand. And I know that doesn't sound very romantic. I was in a very practical kind of survival, take care of my family mode at that time. And interestingly enough, if you had asked me 4 years earlier what I was going to do for a career, I would have said pursue a career on Broadway. I spent my entire life from the age of 3 till high school, till I was 18, in band and drama and musical theater and voice, and I took Royal Conservatory piano. So those that knew me in high school, when they find out I'm an engineer, they're usually like, "Huh, I didn't picture that for you." So you never know. But I do think engineers, we need all types of people in engineering. We need visionaries and dreamers and musicians and artists. And I've met so many people that fit that description. And I think one of the things that has been unfortunate in engineering is that people think you have to be one type of person. You have to be a very linear thinker that loves to sit in front of spreadsheets all day. And I'm nothing like that, but I have loved my career in engineering for over 20 years. So just quick sidebar, I chose chemical engineering at SAIT, and which is the Southern Alberta Institute of Technology. It was a 2-year program. And the reason I chose chemical engineering as opposed to petroleum engineering was because I knew chemical engineering had a lot more options. So I could go into petroleum engineering, I could go into the oil and gas industry where my dad worked, or I could go into the agri-food industry, working on reducing waste, reducing emissions, reducing water use, working in discovering cleaner fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, innovations in processing food. Chemical engineers are trained in processes. I could go into the health industry. There's a lot more evolution in the combining of biomedicine with engineering. And so I could go into development of vaccines, that sort of thing. There's so many. I've heard people refer to chemical engineers as the hidden engineer because you can find us almost anywhere. I was passionate about clean water and sanitation. And one of the reasons I got into, so I spent 20 years of my career focused on sustainability and environmental performance and regulatory compliance. And one of the main reasons I was drawn to that was the year I graduated from SAIT, chemical engineering. Remember, I picked the highest demand, expected salary, shortest time in school, and prayed I would find something that I was passionate about. And in 2000, the year I graduated, there was a movie that came out called Erin Brockovich. Now, as the years go on, my audience, less and less people, if we were in a live setting, I would ask you to raise your hand if you've heard of Erin Brockovich. And I will tell you, over the past 20 years, less and less hands would go up. But I highly recommend that you look into this story. It's a true story. And it's about a woman who discovered that a company in the United States was leaching carcinogenic or cancer-causing chemicals into the groundwater of a town called Hinckley, California. And they were doing this. They were polluting the groundwater for like 30, 40 years before this was discovered. And it was making people sick. And it's not the first time that sort of thing has happened. Our regulations have changed drastically over the past 40, 50, 60 years. And there's still a lot of historical cleanup that needs to be done. And when I saw this movie, it felt like a call to action for me. I really, really wanted to be a part of future solutions. So I graduated from chemical engineering technology, and I decided to go in the oil and gas industry. Now, at the time, we weren't talking about renewable energy the way we are today. We weren't talking about energy transitions the way we are today. We were talking about it almost like a futuristic thing, but I'm seeing so much more happen now, which is really exciting. But I decided to go into the oil and gas industry to be part of the solution and to focus on environmental compliance and sustainability. And so nowadays, there's so much more opportunities as we're in this global energy transition of reliance on non-renewable energy sources and balancing where we get our energy. But I want you to think about the fact that you are in, no matter who you are, whether you're a student joining today, a professional, a parent, or a teacher, we are all part of the energy system. And I find that until I looked at it that way, there were a lot of polarized conversations like oil and gas is bad, oil and gas is good, oil and gas, is good for the economics, or oil and gas is bad for the environment, which is it's very polarizing. And I realized when I looked at it as the energy system, whether or not we work for a renewable energy company or a non-renewable energy company or a transportation company like a trucking company or a pipeline company, or whether we are just heating our homes, driving our cars, using energy as consumers, using electricity, we are all part of the system. So if we look at the global energy transition in that way, we can start looking at working on this together. And I truly believe that when we bring more Indigenous knowledge, wisdom, and voices into this conversation and truly listen, we can find solutions we never, ever have thought of before. And so you find chemical engineers in all industries. My first career that I call it, I spent 7 years in the oil and gas industry, predominantly, like I said, in environmental and environmental compliance operations, and predominantly in the upstream. So what I mean by upstream is from the well, you'll see in this picture, from the well gathering lines to the tanks before the oil or gas goes to a major pipeline transmission line. That's upstream. And that's the areas that I worked in for the first 7 years of my career. At that point, I realized I wanted to advance my career even further. I was a certified engineering technologist and not a professional engineer, and I wanted to be a professional engineer. So I went back to school, and that's what brought me to Thunder Bay. So I'm just going to go through this a little bit. So I went back to school. That brought me to Thunder Bay because Lakehead University in Thunder Bay has a relatively unique transfer program where I was able to get almost 2 years credit for my diploma from SAIT. So I had been out of school for a while, so I will tell you the math was a little challenging. I hadn't done calculus in 7 years, 8 years. And my son was in junior high by that point, and he was helping me remember the rules of trigonometry and the rules of algebra and FOIP, or not FOIP, FOIL, yes. Oh my goodness. And when I think of trig, I remember walking through university with a university calculus book in one hand and my son's junior high math textbook in the other hand, and just saying SOHCAHTOA. SOHCAHTOA. So if you know what SOHCAHTOA is, that's very, very important sign, opposite. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that. But I was at Lakehead University in chemical engineering. That's our logo for the Lakehead Engineers. Now, let me go back just a little bit. When I was doing my high school upgrading, before I went to SAIT, that was also the same year I found my birth mom. And I found out that I was Cree Dene. Well, I didn't really know what that meant or know what to do with that. I knew very little about Indigenous people. I knew very little about my culture, my family, where I came from, and even the history that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. And so when I got to Lakehead University, I was introduced to the Native Students Association, and it was amazing because the students and the faculty that were supporting it were so welcoming. And I went to speak to the Aboriginal counselor there, and she started me down this journey of learning my history. And that was the first time I learned I was part of the 60 Scoop. I also learned at that time there were over 100 First Nations in Canada that didn't have clean drinking water. And I had always dreamed about going to a developing nation to help bring water. as an engineer. And finding out that there were over 100 nations in Canada that didn't have clean drinking water was shocking and saddening to me. And so I started down that journey of reconnection. When I graduated from Lakehead, I came back to Calgary. I entered my career number 2. I was hired by a global engineering firm in the pipeline industry. Now, a lot of people that might raise some eyebrows because we hear a lot in the news about opposition, Indigenous peoples, and opposition to pipelines. And so I want to start by saying, first of all, I don't speak for all Indigenous peoples. And there are many, many Indigenous people working in the oil and gas industry, and many Indigenous people that oppose development or oppose specific projects. But it's not black and white. It's not cut and dry. And I come from a long line of water protectors that oppose certain projects, and for good reason. And that was the year that I really started to listen. I stopped looking at the people protesting oil and gas development as opposition to a project that I wanted to go through, and started listening to understand the opposition. And that really changed things for me. And I started to get to know my birth family. I attended family reunions. I met my birth mom. That's my birth mom. And the tall gentleman behind her is my brother. And the little one is my son, who is now 10. And the other gentleman is my husband. I have 3 kids and 1 granddaughter. And so I started attending conferences. And so career number 3 was when I realized, after about 6 years working in pipelines, that I wanted to do this work separate. I wanted to bring both sides of me together in the work that I did. At the time, I was doing the job of an engineer and passionate about Indigenous inclusion, and the work with Indigenous peoples and communities was outside of my full-time job, which was a little bit exhausting. I had a full-time job, but then I would take vacation days or flex days to go teach pipelines to First Nations, or to give science presentations to Indigenous youth, or to work on an Indigenous youth camp that we have that brings STEAM into the conversation. And I really wanted to bring those 2 sides of me together. So I left my job in management at a pipeline company and started my own consultancy called Indigenous Engineering Inclusion. And that's when I decided to actually put the concept of Indigeneering into action in the work that I did. And so I would teach companies about my journey and about Indigenous peoples and inclusion. And I would, at the same time, also work with Indigenous nations to help them understand the process in oil and gas and in pipelines, in terms of permitting, environmental monitoring, which led me to go back to SAIT to teach a program called Indigenous Pipeline Monitoring, to empower Indigenous people to monitor pipelines in their traditional lands. And then last year, I joined the University of Calgary as the first teaching chair focused on integrating Indigenous perspectives into engineering. And it's still early days, but I've learned a lot in this space. Part of that was learning from elders and listening to the teachings and integrating them into my work. So the values that I developed for my consulting company were were based on the 7 sacred Anishinaabeg or grandfather teachings. And I just wanted to bring that up because I think I'm probably one of a few engineering firms that has a permit to practice whose values are based on love and respect and courage. I mean, I don't mean that those values aren't there, but very specifically. And when I say my work is done with love, I mean I come from the perspective of we can show up in the world with love or with fear. And my journey has been all about recognizing when I'm feeling reactions based on fear and really going inwards to figure out why that is and making it about me, figuring out why I feel that way. And when you approach any sort of conflict that way, and decide to show up with love, decide to show up with respect and courage and honesty, wisdom, humility, and truth, it can really change the way you work with colleagues, with your friends, with your peers. It can change the entire energy of the environment that you're working in. So very briefly, Indigenous peoples in Canada, I always want to, and I will share these slides as well. When I say Indigenous, I mean First Nations people, Metis people, and Inuit people. So I'm First Nations, Cree, Dene, and Irish. And I don't speak for all Indigenous peoples. We have 634 First Nations communities in Canada, greater than 50 nations and greater than 50 languages. So if you take away anything about Indigenous peoples from this short conversation today, it's that Indigenous peoples are so diverse. And we have very different protocols and traditions and stories. And I'm always learning, and I don't know everything about every nation. And I always sort of preface with an apology that if I say anything that lands wrong, I'm sorry, I am learning, and please let me know. And to me, that's about creating safe spaces and brave spaces to learn, and as opposed to approaching it with fear of saying the wrong thing, approaching it with courage and saying, hey, if I say the wrong thing, please let me know. And I want to learn, I want to do better. Métis people in Canada are separate and distinct cultures. So I do not identify as Métis, and I don't speak for people that do identify as Métis. And I basically leave the self-identification and explanations of what Métis is to somebody who identifies as Métis. And same with Inuit people in Canada, people of the North. Singular is Inuk. And in Canada, the Inuit live in the northern territory of Nunavut, in the northern third of Quebec, in Labrador, and parts of the Northwest Territories. One thing that I do think is really important to share is Eskimo is considered a pejorative term. So the work that I'm doing today is led by the teachings of Elder Reg Croshu. And so I'm teaching engineering courses. I'm teaching one course called Technology in Society, and it's really it's a mandatory course for all engineers, and it's an exploration of the impact that technology has had on society historically and to today and looking into the future. So think about the telephone. Nowadays we all have cell phones. We probably don't all have cell phones, but nowadays we have smartphones where you can access the internet. Remember when I was getting ready to go into post-secondary, when I was in doing my high school upgrading, I didn't have a cell phone, let alone readily accessible internet. And so you think about the evolution of the telephone. And how that's changed communication and changed society. The evolution of transportation from horses to buggies to cars to today, to the electric car, to the future. And so that course is one of the first courses at the university that I have been given the opportunity to weave Indigenous perspectives and topics and knowledge throughout the entire course. And I do that using the concept of ethical space. And basically I'm not the owner of this teaching. This is Elder Reg Croshu, but this concept has really guided the work that I do now. Ethical space is the space of cultural safety where you can bring Indigenous oral culture and Western written culture together. It's not about mixing one and the other. And it's also not about bringing one into another structure and expecting it to fit in. And that's what makes the concept of the work that I'm doing, it's going to be very long term. It doesn't happen overnight. And it's something that I'm committed to doing as long as I have the benefit of doing this. And so I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm also teaching environmental and sustainable development in energy, and I'm doing the same thing, bringing in Indigenous knowledge keepers, Indigenous elders, getting my class to learn how to do a traditional land acknowledgement. We've had elder-led sharing circles, and just really exploring how to show up in engineering in a different way, and how to start looking through a new lens. And there's an elder, Mi'kmaq elder, Albert Marshall, who teaches the concept of two-eyed seeing. And that's what I'm trying to expose and bring my students into, to invite them to see the world through an Indigenous lens, in a holistic way, in a more sustainable way, in a way where we look at ourselves as caretakers of the land and caretakers of each other. And we are all interconnected. And I'm just really excited to have had the chance to share this with you today. And I just look forward to having a conversation. I really hope that that you enjoyed my presentation.
Miigwech, oh my gosh, thank you so much, Deanna. Every time I hear you speak about your journey, I get shivers. I get so excited about your journey along the way and the changes and the adaptations that you've gone through. One of your last comment that you were talking about with the ethical space, and that understanding the Indigenous culture and then understanding what's happening in the Western culture. And it's not about this coming together and blending everything in. I think that's the first time that I've heard it exactly the way you've put it, and it hit something with me. And I think that some of our perspective, or personally, my experience has been a lot of people are trying to blend these together. So can you elaborate a bit more on that ethical space?
Actually, thank you. When I first learned about that concept, and Elder Reg, he also teaches about the risk of cultural confusion if you try to blend.
Yeah.
Because they're two very different ways of looking at the world. And so it's about creating that equitable value. It's about being open to valuing Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous oral history, Indigenous traditional knowledge equitably with Western knowledge. And when we look at Western knowledge, it's very much, oftentimes it's focused on like formal education, or how many letters or degrees you have behind your name, and in some ways there's a reason, like for example, professional engineers, there's a reason it's important that we get our professional engineering designation. There's a reason engineering is a protected title. And that's because, if things aren't developed or built by somebody who is skilled in that space, that's when things can go wrong, and that's when people get hurt, or the environment is harmed. So I totally understand that. But at the same time, when I learn more about Indigenous history and science and technology that has come since time immemorial, Indigenous people have innately been engineers. And so it's not diminishing the importance of engineering being a protected title and having to have the proper education to go design a bridge. But it's about understanding that Indigenous science has equitable value in knowledge that can enhance the work we do as engineers. If we bring in that knowledge of the land and that understanding of, how to mitigate harm, how to reduce harm on migratory birds, on caribou migration, on water quality, on the life in our streams and lakes and oceans when we're building a pipeline and drilling underneath a river. Imagine if we involved Indigenous knowledge keepers and elders at the very beginning of a project and worked together to not only make this a financially well project, a economically well project for the community and for jobs and all of that, but also a balanced and more sustainable project.
Well, I know there are some students that are listening that are currently in engineering, chemical engineering, and I know they are so jealous. They would love to be able to be taking your course right now. And I have to admit, so do I. This would be such an amazing course to take part of. And you mentioned earlier on in your presentation the Erin Brockovich, and there's a number of us that do remember that film. So don't worry, that did come up.
And that's great. I've been following that story like since then, and I still show it in my class with a lot of disclaimers about language, just for any teachers out there. Because it is such an important story. But I mean, there's another documentary that I just showed in my class yesterday that's on Netflix called There's Something in the Water. And it is powerful. It is, it's about water pollution in and around, it's focused on environmental racism and how there's a lot of areas that have pollution that are right next to where the reserves have been put, and conversations about equity and how racialized and Indigenous peoples have lower health outcomes because of things like this, and I won't go there's a few different examples. And I mean, one is around Sarnia, Ontario. All the gas plants or upgraders or things that are in Sarnia. But my family in Fort Chipewyan has been impacted by the oil and gas industry for decades, and the oil sands. And I by no means would demonize energy, but we still need to start focusing on the impact on the land and the people around it.
Now, what project would you say would be probably the most impactful one that you have personally worked on and felt like, yes, this is really bringing all the pieces together for me? That you're allowed to talk about.
Yeah.
I know it's a tough one.
Well, it's funny. I think the first powerful moment was when there's a couple things that come to mind from an environmental. It was actually a really small project that actually taught me that, yeah, I can make a difference, because it was very early on in my career. And the Alberta Energy Regulator was called the Energy Utilities Board at the time, but they gave me the opportunity, or sorry, they came out with a new regulation, which happens quite frequently.
Yeah.
And usually it happens because either regulations get tighter or something bad happened. And that's one of the reasons I've been so passionate about teaching regulations, because why wait till something bad happens? Let's be proactive. And that's where the industry is going now, more risk-based compliance. But they came out with a new regulation for air emissions, for flaring and venting of wells. Okay. So oil wells that had solution gas that comes out when you produce the oil to the surface and the pressure changes, gas will come out naturally. In some wells, in some wells it's a lot of gas, in some wells it's not a lot of gas. But there were a lot of oil sites that didn't have any way of capturing the gas, so the gas was either vented, once upon a time, it's not allowed anymore, or flared to atmosphere, which has emissions impacts. And so the regulator came out with a rule that you had to do an economic analysis to see whether it was economic to build a pipeline and tie that gas in. And so I was asked to go do that economic analysis. I did the economic analysis, and I came back to my boss at the time, and I said, it is not economic based on the cost of tying it in. And he said, okay, well, what else can we do? And so I ended up getting to work on this project where we ended up renting a generator, tying the gas into the generator, connecting the generator to our pump jacks, the pumps that were used to pump the oil. And instead of using natural gas off the grid, we were using our own gas to power the pump jacks. So we were not flaring the gas. We were saving operations costs, like every year. And I was like, this is brilliant, because it's good for the environment. It's justifiable from an economic standpoint, and it's making a difference overall. Like, it was so exciting. And I just wish that we thought about things that way at the very start. Like, hey, I'm building this 6-well pad, and there's going to be solution gas. So I'm going to I'm going to use the solution gas to power the pump jacks, like as a
forethought, like
an upfront decision.
Yeah, exactly. Wow, that is amazing. So yeah, I can understand why that one made a true impact for you.
And then the other one is when I was invited. I had taught at SAIT for 15 years, taught like just oil and gas courses, geology, drilling, completions, production operations. I was asked to, about 3 years ago, develop and deliver the Indigenous pipeline monitoring program to 60 Indigenous students from across Alberta. And that was just so powerful for me, because I feel like we learned from each other that whole time. Like, there were 3 cohorts of 20. They were amazing people that I'm still in contact with a number of. And I taught them what I knew about pipeline regulations and monitoring and environmental monitoring in the industry. But they taught me what they knew, like about their traditional lands, and it was the most incredible experience. And I don't think I would have thought I could do what I'm doing now at the university had I not had that first opportunity to step into indigenizing or decolonizing curricula, because there's no one way to do that, and that's a huge journey.
Well, I'm happy you're bringing that point up as well. So one of the questions that is coming up for us right now also is hearing more about indigenizing the post-secondary curriculums. And can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, okay, I'm only going to, again, I feel like I'm giving a lot of disclaimers. Like, if I was a corporate presentation, the first slide that corporate presentations put out that had like 500 words of nothing in this presentation is, anyway.
Absolutely. No,
I'm going to give my opinion
yes.
on indigenization and decolonization, because they vary, and they're as diverse as Indigenous peoples. For myself, I think the first thing that I believe is that indigenization of something is different from decolonization. When we first started hearing these terms, I remember people saying, well, I prefer indigenization because decolonization has negative connotations. And I'm like, our history has negative connotations. Like, colonization has negative connotations. Like, that's why we're doing this work. And so I believe that we need to start the journey of decolonization before we can safely indigenize something, because indigenization to me implies bringing Indigenous perspectives. And if you're not going to change the spaces you're bringing them into, you are going to end up causing further harm, like appropriation, inappropriate use of Indigenous traditional knowledge. Like, decolonization, part of that is really an internal journey. It's the journey every person, I believe, needs to take to learn the history of colonization, to realize that what we see as the way the world is not the way everybody sees the way the world is. That the hierarchical methods of both academia and the corporate world are not an Indigenous way. That sort of bottom line, profit driven, capitalistic perspective is, and this sounds very general, and I don't mean to generalize it, and I don't mean to pan-indigenize Indigenous ways either, because when I say pan-indigenize, just for anyone that hasn't heard that term, it means sometimes we think every Indigenous person has a dream catcher, or every Indigenous person has teepees, or like it's understanding that there are so many different nations. There's Cree, Dene, Haida, Haisla, Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee. Like there are hundreds of different Indigenous peoples, and it's not all one way. And so it's not about understanding every Indigenous person's way, but about changing the way we approach people and making room for those ways. And I remember, like, inclusion. I read a quote about inclusion in one of the books on decolonization that I've been reading for my study, for my research. And it said inclusion is not about bringing someone into an existing way. It's about making things a better place for everyone. And to me, that's so powerful, because we hear a lot about inclusion. And I personally believe that inclusion is an action. And inclusion isn't about understanding everything about every different piece of diversity, because diversity is everywhere.
Oh,
Diversity is diversity in belief systems, diversity in religion, diversity in socioeconomic upbringing or socioeconomic place, diversity in height, skin color, personality. I'm an engineer with ADHD who is in the Myers-Briggs scale and ENFP. I bring diversity into a lot of the rooms I work in. But sometimes you can't see it until you hear me talk, and my stories aren't very linear. But so inclusion is about asking yourself, how can I make the people around me, how can I gift them belonging?
That is beautiful. That is a beautiful way to think about this. And I know as a non-Indigenous person, I've been learning so much thanks to all of our Indigenous advisors and people like yourself about the Indigenous culture. And it is really a personal journey on when you're ready to start opening up and learning about all of this. And the Indigenous Ingenuity exhibit really allows that space, allows to discover and learn all in one. And it's so exciting as you start talking with people like yourself, like Deanna. You are absolutely fabulous. You are a gem.
Thank
and
you.
There's one thing I want to make sure that we get in there for today, for all of those students that are in high school, even the post-secondary students that are still not 100% sure of what they want to do just yet. What advice could you leave with them?
Oh, goodness. Yeah, I would say, honestly, spend the time getting to know yourself and valuing your worth. Because right now, no matter where you are, whether you're in grade 7 or post-secondary, you have brilliance and you have purpose that is already within you. And so find those things that light you up. Notice when you get energy. Notice when you get goosebumps. Notice when you get excited. Expose yourself to different talks, to different topics, now it's so much easier to access, at least now that so many digital platforms. Like, notice when you light up and follow that, and realize that you belong in that space if it lights you up. Because if it lights you up, then you are going to bring your brilliance there.
That is absolutely perfect. Miigwech, thank you so much, Deanna, for joining us today. And for everybody that was online listening to us today, thank you so very much. We look forward to having more of these conversations and going through our journey of learning and really learning about the people that are doing some amazing things out in the world today. So Deanna, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining.
Have a wonderful day, everyone.